The soft light of dawn settled over the suburban mansion where Thomas, a successful yet lonely businessman, lived with his son Henry. After a tragic accident claimed his wife, Henry had fallen into darkness, both literally and figuratively. For Thomas, the mansion now felt like an empty shell, echoing with the memories of a family that once was. The 7-year-old boy, who lost his sight in the accident, had also shut himself off from the world, including his father, who struggled to find a way to help his son heal. Thomas, burdened by work and the weight of his own grief, was at a loss. When a friend suggested hiring a new caregiver, he accepted out of desperation. Enter Elena, a single mother and former music teacher, living with her lively and curious 5-year-old daughter, Sophie. With her gentle hands and the patience only a mother could have, Elena agreed to take on the job at Thomas's estate, bringing Sophie along. A car rolled to a stop in front of the stately mansion, its ivy-covered walls standing tall and imposing. Elena stepped out, her expression a mix of determination and trepidation. Beside her, Sophie's wide eyes sparkled with wonder. "Mom, is this where we're going to live? It looks like a castle from a fairy tale," the little girl exclaimed. Thomas appeared at the top of the steps, his eyes weary but his demeanor poised. He extended a hand to Elena, his voice low and gravelly. "Thank you for coming. I hope you and your daughter can bring some change for Henry." Elena offered a soft smile, sensing the pain hidden behind his composed exterior. "I'll do my best," she replied, her gaze drifting to the dark windows above, where Henry was silently tucked away. Elena followed Thomas into the sprawling mansion. The tall walls, endless corridors, and soft light streaming through large windows created an atmosphere that was both majestic and cold. Thomas led Elena to the main sitting room, where a stern-faced housekeeper stood waiting. "Sophie, why don't you go with the housekeeper? She'll show you around the house," Elena said gently to her daughter. Sophie, eager and full of excitement, grabbed the housekeeper's hand and skipped away, turning back briefly to smile at her mother. "I'll be back soon, Mom," she chirped, before disappearing around the corner of the staircase. Thomas watched Sophie go, then turned to Elena with a softer expression. "She's a bright child. Hopefully, she can bring some of that light to Henry." They ascended to the second floor, stopping in front of a closed door. "He spends most of his time in here," Thomas said, his voice tinged with concern. "Henry doesn't like strangers, but I hope you can gradually help him open up." Elena nodded, taking a deep breath before knocking gently on the door. There was no response. Thomas sighed and turned the knob, pushing the door open slightly. Inside, the room was dim, with thick curtains drawn tightly over the windows. Only the soft glow of a bedside lamp illuminated the space. Henry sat curled up in the corner of the bed, his face turned away, as though trying to shut out the world. "Henry!" Thomas called softly, but the boy didn't respond. He glanced at Elena, apologetic. "I'll leave you to try." With that, he stepped out, leaving Elena alone in the quiet room. Elena approached slowly, her gaze warm and understanding. She didn't speak immediately, but pulled a chair closer to the bed, maintaining a respectful distance. "Henry, my name is Elena," she said softly. "I'm here to help you, or just to sit here if that's what you prefer." Henry didn't reply, but his small shoulders trembled slightly. Elena decided to remain still, her presence calm and non-intrusive. After a moment, she opened her small handbag and took out a music box. She turned the key gently, and a soothing melody filled the room. Henry tilted his head slightly, his ears clearly drawn to the sound. Elena said nothing more, letting the music speak for her. In the quiet room, the first threads of a fragile connection began to form. As time went by, Elena and Sophie gradually began to unlock the doors to Henry's heart. Though still quiet and reserved, Henry started to accept their presence. Sophie, with her cheerful and innocent nature, constantly found ways to make Henry smile. Elena, with her sensitivity and patience as a mother, provided a sense of safety and warmth. One afternoon, while Sophie was playing in the garden, Elena noticed Henry sitting alone in the corner of the living room. His expression was heavy with sadness, though he didn't say a word. She approached quietly, taking a seat on a chair across from him, leaving enough space so he wouldn't feel pressured. "Henry," Elena spoke gently, "would you like to go outside with Sophie today? I think you'd enjoy the garden." Henry shook his head, his small shoulders trembling slightly. Elena didn't push him. She simply sat there in silence, letting him know she was there. After a long moment, Henry spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "Miss Elena, I miss my mom so much." Elena froze, her heart breaking at the pain in his words, as if they carried the weight of a wound that had never healed. "Do you want to tell me about her?" she asked, her tone soft and warm. Henry hesitated but eventually nodded. She was so kind," he began, his gaze distant. "She used to sing to me every night. She loved telling stories. She told me that one day I'd grow up to be strong, just like Dad." His eyes filled with tears. "But now she's gone, and I don't know how to be strong." Elena leaned forward slightly, resting a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Henry, you don't have to be strong right away," she said, her voice steady and comforting. "Sometimes just remembering your mom and holding on to the beautiful memories is enough to make you strong." Henry looked up at her, tears streaming down his cheeks. For a moment he hesitated, unsure if he should let his guard down. But Elena's calm presence felt like a safety net, and as she slowly pulled him into a gentle hug, the walls he had built around his heart began to crumble. At first he was stiff, but then he broke down completely, sobbing into her shoulder, releasing the grief and loneliness he had been holding onto for so long. Elena held him tightly, whispering soft reassurances that he wasn't alone. Once Henry had calmed down, Sophie came running into the room, carrying a small pouch filled with objects she had collected. "Henry, guess what I have?" she said excitedly. Henry smiled faintly and shook his head. Sophie placed a small, round, and soft object in his hand. "This is a pine cone I picked from the garden. Feel it. It's prickly but not sharp." Henry carefully touched the pine cone, laughing softly at its rough texture. "It feels like a spiky little ball," he said. Sophie giggled, then handed him a large leaf. "And this is a leaf. I'll help you feel the entire garden without even needing to look. What do you think?" Henry held the leaf, his fingers tracing the delicate veins along its surface. A small glimmer of hope sparked within him as he realized that there was still so much of the world he could experience, even without his sight. Weeks passed, and Henry slowly grew accustomed to having Elena and Sophie around the house. Though still reserved, he no longer resisted when Elena sat nearby, or when Sophie enthusiastically invited him to play little games. Elena's patience and gentle demeanor began to crack open a small door in Henry's heart. One beautiful afternoon, Elena decided to take the children out to the expansive garden behind the mansion. "The weather is lovely today," she said to Henry, lightly touching his shoulder. "It would be good for you to get some fresh air." Henry hesitated, but with Elena's encouragement and Sophie's cheerful invitation, he agreed. Sophie grabbed Henry's hand and led him down the stone paths. "Can you hear the birds singing?" Sophie asked, her voice full of excitement. "This garden is so beautiful." The trio stopped at a sunny corner of the garden where light streamed through the trees. Elena sat on a stone bench nearby, taking out her small guitar. She began to play a soft, soothing melody, as gentle as the breeze rustling through the leaves. Meanwhile, Sophie continued to guide Henry through the garden, letting him touch the leaves and flowers. "This is a rose," Sophie said, placing Henry's hand on a soft flower. "Can you feel it? It's so beautiful." Henry remained quiet, his hand lightly brushing against the petals. Then, suddenly he spoke, his voice low and trembling. "No, this is a hydrangea." Sophie froze, her eyes widening in shock. Elena stopped playing, her hands trembling as emotion swelled within her. "Henry!" she whispered, barely able to believe what she had just heard. Henry stood still, his breath caught in his throat as he tried to make sense of what he was feeling. Slowly, he blinked. Once, twice, and a faint light pierced through the darkness. His heart raced. I think I can see," he whispered, his voice trembling. Blinking again, the blurry shapes of the garden began to take form. I can see," Henry exclaimed, tears streaming down his face as he turned to Sophie. "I can really see." Sophie threw her arms around Henry, sobbing with joy. Elena walked over, placing a hand on his shoulder, tears rolling down her cheeks. "Henry, this is truly a miracle," she said, her voice thick with emotion. The three of them stood there in the garden, bathed in golden sunlight, as the unexpected joy of the moment wrapped around them like a warm embrace. Thomas heard Henry's exclamation from inside the house and rushed out to the garden. As he stepped through the small gate, the sight before him made him freeze. Henry was standing in the sunlight, tightly holding Sophie's hand, his eyes gleaming with a joy that words couldn't describe. Elena stood nearby, her face a mixture of emotion and amazement. "Henry?" Thomas called, his voice trembling. He stepped closer, almost unable to believe what he was seeing. You can see?" Henry turned, tears still glistening in his eyes. "Yes, Dad, I can see!" He broke into sobs, running into Thomas's arms. "I can really see!" Thomas held his son tightly, tears streaming down his own face. "Thank God," he whispered, his voice shaking. "I've waited so long for this moment." Sophie stood beside her mother, gripping her hand. "Mom, he can see now. A real miracle happened," she said, her voice bright with excitement. Elena nodded, her gentle gaze resting on Thomas and Henry. "Sometimes," she said softly, her voice warm and steady, "what we need isn't medicine or the best doctors. It's love and hope." Thomas looked up, his eyes meeting Elena's. In that moment, he didn't just see the woman who had helped his son find light again. He realized she was the light that both he and Henry had been missing in their lives. From that day on, the mansion was no longer a somber place. Henry and Sophie's laughter filled the halls, mingling with the soothing melodies Elena played on quiet afternoons. Thomas often found himself sitting with Elena at the end of each day, listening to her stories or simply savoring the peaceful silence they shared. As time passed, Elena and Sophie's presence not only brought joy to Henry, but also began to change Thomas. Once a reserved and distant man, he found himself smiling more and feeling a renewed sense of purpose as he watched his son slowly heal. Sophie, with her innocent and cheerful nature, was the first to break through the ice around his heart. One morning, while Thomas was reading the newspaper in the living room, Sophie approached him with a picture book in her hands. "Mr. Thomas, can you read this to me?" she asked, her eyes sparkling with anticipation. Surprised, Thomas hesitated but couldn't refuse. He set the newspaper aside and began reading. Sophie snuggled close to him, as if seeking the warmth of a grandfather. Gradually, Thomas realized that Sophie's innocent affection was giving him a sense of family he had long forgotten. On another day, Sophie dragged Thomas out to the garden to show him a small house she and Henry had been building out of twigs. "What do you think? I think it'll be our secret hideout," Sophie explained enthusiastically. As Thomas crouched down to inspect their creation, he found himself laughing for the first time in a long while. "Young lady, you're quite the architect," he said, feeling a surprising warmth in his heart. One evening, after Henry and Sophie had gone to bed, Thomas found Elena in the kitchen, washing glasses. The soft glow of the kitchen light illuminated her gentle features. "I owe you a thank you," Thomas said, his voice low but sincere. "Not just for Henry, but for me as well. You've brought light back into this house." Elena paused, looking at Thomas with a faint smile. "No one can live in darkness forever, Thomas. I just did what felt right." They began to talk about their pasts, about the pain they had both endured. Thomas shared memories of his late wife and how powerless he had felt in protecting his family. Elena opened up about her struggles as a single mother, trying to balance love and survival. Through their conversations, the distance between them began to shrink. Thomas no longer saw Elena as just a caregiver, but as someone he could lean on, a partner in his journey toward healing. The sunset bathed the backyard of the mansion in a warm orange glow. Elena and Sophie were busy setting up the outdoor BBQ table, while Thomas and Henry worked on the grill. The air was filled with laughter as the two children teased each other, and even Thomas couldn't help but smile at the joyful scene. "Mr. Thomas, the coals are ready," Sophie called out, holding a tray of marinated meat. "Hurry up, or Mom and I will eat everything before you even get started." Thomas chuckled, taking the tray from her. Henry stood beside his father, a quiet smile lighting up his face as the evening sun reflected in his eyes. "I think the meat will burn if Sophie keeps hopping around like that," Henry joked, making Sophie stick out her tongue and laugh. As night fell, the string lights hanging from the trees illuminated the garden, creating a cozy and intimate atmosphere. Elena and Sophie sat at the table, enjoying their meal, when Thomas suddenly stood up, raising his glass. "I'd like to say a few words," Thomas began. his eyes meeting each person at the table before resting on Elena. "Elena, your presence and Sophie's has transformed my life and Henry's. You brought back something I thought I had lost forever: hope and love." Elena blushed slightly, smiling warmly. Sophie looked at Thomas with wide, expectant eyes, sensing something extraordinary was about to happen. Thomas turned to Henry. "Son, what would you think about officially inviting Elena and Sophie to become part of our family?" Henry looked at his father, then at Elena. "I think that's the best idea you've ever had," he said, with a bright smile. Thomas reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. He stepped toward Elena, kneeling before her with eyes full of love and sincerity. "Elena, you've been the light that helped me through my darkest days, and I want to spend the rest of my life with you. Will you marry me?" Elena gasped, her hand covering her mouth as tears welled up in her eyes. Sophie jumped up, clapping her hands and shouting, "Mom, say yes, say yes!" Elena glanced at her daughter, then back at Thomas, who looked at her with unwavering sincerity. She took a deep breath, her voice trembling with joy as she finally said, "Yes, I will." Sophie squealed with excitement, wrapping her arms around Elena, while Thomas gently slipped the ring onto her finger. The moment was perfect, filled with love and hope. Thomas gently slipped the ring onto her finger, and the two stood up amidst cheers and applause from the two children. Sophie hugged her mother tightly while Henry grabbed his father's hand and said, "I'm so happy. This is the best day ever." The BBQ continued with laughter and twinkling lights filling the night. Henry and Sophie worked together to hang the remaining string lights on the trees, playfully arguing over who did a better job. Meanwhile, Thomas and Elena stood by the grill, watching the children with warm smiles. "We're not just a family," Thomas said, wrapping his arms around Elena. "We're pieces of a puzzle that finally found each other." Elena leaned into him, her smile soft and radiant. "And that makes it all worthwhile."